something broke into his barn. At night, it didn't come for food. The barn door blew, wide 10 below, and the north wind knifed through dried boards while some piece of metal scraped the dark like a cold tooth. The barn door tore off its latch and hay lifted into a pale blur. Jonah Reed lunged, hand on the rifle hanging from a nail, and stopped. The feed trough stood untouched. The grain sacks were still tied. Whatever broke in hadn't come for food. The shadow halted at the tool rack. It didn't grab a hammer. It didn't paw the ropes. It searched for one thing: the bolt cutters. A thick, furred hand lifted the cutters, set them down at Jonah's boot, then slowly raised the other arm to eye level. A steel trap bit deep there, black with blood and hair. No roar, just standing like someone who had come too far to still have the strength to say please. In the lamplight, Jonah saw his own face reflected in those eyes. The cattle in the corner didn't panic. They merely pressed into the warmest pocket as if they already knew this wasn't a hunter, and in Jonah's head a sentence snapped into place cold and clear. If it didn't come to eat, it came to live. He lifted the rifle off the nail and hung it back up, not surrender. A line drawn by a man who knows how to balance fear with sense. "All right," Jonah said, slow, as if he were talking to himself. "If you're bigger than my fear, then I've got to be bigger than yours." He nudged the cutters forward with his boot. The shadow eased half a step back and offered the trapped wrist close enough to trust, far enough to retreat if it had to. Two beings on opposite sides of a barn lamp, and between them, a tool, a choice. Steel had chewed through fur and into bone. The air smelled of iron and wind. Jonah understood this trap wasn't the forest's. It was something men set to drag the forest close and force it to yield. But tonight, the forest had walked into the barn not to surrender, but to borrow a hand that knew how to open locks. He took a wool scarf, a bottle of liquor, and warm water from the oil stove. No oaths, no ceremony, just the old kid of a spare, straight life. He looked up. "It's going to hurt. I won't rush." The shadow didn't answer. Its eyes blinked once, like a person nodding. Outside, the wind drew a long moan from the rusted wind tower. Farther off, some trap bell on the fence trembled so faint it was like a question riding the gusts. Jonah glanced toward the sound, then back. The decision had been made the moment the cutters touched the floor between them. The rest would only be keeping his word. Some nights don't ask us to be stronger than other people, they ask us to be decent enough not to do the cowardly thing in the face of fear. Before we squeeze those cutters and hear the steel give, tell me where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments. When the story ends, rate it from 0 to 10. Now let's step into part 1, the frozen ridge and the early signs, because no decision is born in an instant. It starts on a longer, colder, lonelier day than you think. Part 1. The frozen ridge and the early signs. Morning arrived thin and metallic, a sky the color of a saw blade. Jonah Reed took coffee so strong it tasted like iron and walked the fence line with a leather glove stuffed in his coat for a pocket. The wind tower groaned the way old bones do when a storm is thinking about returning. Down in the draw, the shed that used to be his father's sawmill hunched under torn tin, one blade still hanging on a wall like a clock that refused to tell time. He hadn't seen another person in 4 days. That was by design. Cattle don't ask for company, and winter doesn't offer any. What he did see were whispers the land handed him when it had something to say. A scuffle of dirt where there shouldn't be. A wire pulled too taut. A clean, unfamiliar nail in a post that had never been worth fixing. On the south fence, Jonah had strung a row of tin can bells, poor man's perimeter, so the wind could carry news before bootsteps did. They chimed nonsense most nights. Today they barely breathed. Halfway to the north pasture, he caught the first true sign, a print pressed so deep the mud held the shape after the freeze. Not hoof, not boot. Heavy, wide set with the care of something that understood pressure could be a kind of language. Next to it, a smear the size of a hand, dark and iron-scented where snow hadn't sealed it. Jonah knelt, touched the stain with the back of his knuckle, and felt the old rancher's arithmetic rise in him, distance, direction, loss. Whatever bled here had kept moving toward the sawmill. He walked the rest of the line with his head tilted just enough to hear what the mountain meant by quiet. Once a hawk stitched a loop against the gray, then vanished like thread pulled through canvas. Once he passed the salt block and saw it untouched odd, because deer had come bold this winter. The oddity laid itself beside the print and the blood, and didn't argue. By noon he was in the barn, restoring order the storm had shaken loose. He oiled the hinges that mattered and left the bad ones honest. He stacked feed till it looked like a wall, and laced rope through the handles the way his father had crossed, not knotted, so a tired hand, even a shaking one, could undo it. He set the bolt cutters on their hooks by the post, and for no reason he cared to check the edge of the small carpenter's saw twice. When the light began to drain, the wind found a new pitch. The tin can bells on the south fence didn't tinkle, they spoke. Short, long, long, nothing like weather, a pattern. Jonah stood still in the middle of the yard until it came again, less from the south and more from the seam where the pasture met the first row of firs. He thought of the deep print in the mud and the black on his knuckle, and of a story his father used to tell about men who lured bears with snare wire and bacon grease, then swore the mountain had a monster when the snare bit the wrong thing. He took a lantern and walked to the sawmill. The door hung crooked. Inside, a draft made the old blade knock against its nail with a sound like a heartbeat out of time. In the corner where there should have been only broken pallets, there were scuffs the kind you draw when you drag a weight you're trying not to make a trail with. And on the splintered threshold, a mark no tool would leave. Fur and wire polished the wood the way only suffering polishes wood. Jonah stood there until the lantern glass fogged with his breath. He weighed the options the way a man counts nails before choosing a hammer. You could follow the blood and be a fool. You could ignore it and be a different kind of fool. Or you could admit the mountain was making an ask and pretend you hadn't heard. Back at the barn, he tuned the place the way you tune a room for a storm. He slid a timber across the door, but left slack in the chain. He moved the oil stove to the stall with the tightest boards, and set a kettle on low. He folded a wool scarf and laid out liquor and clean cloth on the old grain scale tools of a life that did not include a single first aid class and still knew how to help. Then he checked the root cellar hatch beneath the hay, made sure the ladder would hold more than a man. Dusk came on like a lid. The tin bells coughed once and went quiet, which was worse than noise. In that silence, the wind tower moaned a long, hollow note that seemed to come not from the sky but from the metal itself, remembering heat. Jonah stood at the tool rack thumb on the hinge of the cutters and said aloud what the day had already been telling him. Something out there is hurt, and something else out there wants the hurt to last. He lifted the lantern and held it at shoulder height. The barn looked like a church that had given all its hymns to winter. The cattle watched him with those soft, unjudging eyes that make a man either tell the truth or leave the room. All right, he said to no one in particular. If it comes, it won't come for feed. A breath moved along the seam of the door, the kind of cold that carries decision. Jonah set the lantern down and put his hand on the cutters. Not to use them yet, but to be the kind of man who would. Somewhere out on the south fence, a bell answered in that short, long rhythm, and another closer to the mill answered back. Signals, he realized. Not from the thing that was hurt, but from the men who heard it. He looked at the rifle on the nail. Then he looked at the cutters. Pick one, he told himself, but know what story you're stepping into. He chose and turned the lamp down till it only admitted honesty. Part 2. Face to face in the dark. Would you have read the signs the same way, or would you have walked past the sawmill and pretended the bells were only wind? Part 2. Face to face in the dark. The door didn't crash, it yielded as if the night had measured the room and found it adequate. A shadow stepped in and stopped at the tool rack. No glance for feed or salt. It lifted the bolt cutters, set them at Jonah's boot, then raised the other arm into the lamplight. A steel trap bit above the wrist teeth sunk to dark. Jonah unhooked the rifle, then hung it back. If you're bigger than my fear, he said quietly, I'll be bigger than yours. He folded a wool scarf, uncorked a bottle, warmed water on the oil stove. Hands open, no rush. Up close, the trap had the look of old harm hinge rimed with rust wire, tail twisted and retwisted by men who brag when no one brave is listening. The cattle watched and didn't panic. The shadow lowered to match Jonah's height, angling the ruined wrist into light. "Work," the posture said. "Do it clean." Jonah slid a narrow board under the steel to guard the tendons he couldn't see, braced it to the post so the barn itself could help tighten the scarf until the pulse steadied. He set the cutter's jaws where leverage would be mercy, not noise. Outside, a tin bell tremored in short, long code man, not wind. "One time right," Jonah breathed. He leaned the weight of both shoulders through the cutters. A hard, private click. The jaws relaxed a fraction. Again. Rust powdered his knuckles. The back plate shuddered. The last tooth went from locked to undecided. Now. He eased the trap open and drew the arm free, a thumb's width, then a palm's. No cry. Only a chest-deep resonance like the wind tower when the weather turns east. He poured liquor along the groove, counted, poured again. Wrapped clean cloth with the tidy speed of a rancher who's learned on calves and men. Set warm river stones in a folded sack against the forearm. "You'll keep the hand if you keep it quiet," he said. "Tendons talk when you jerk them." From the south fence, another bell answered closer to the old mill. Signals threaded through metal. Jonah glanced at the root cellar hatch beneath the hay. "Can you walk?" he asked with his hands as much as his voice palm-up tilt of head. The shadow stood not to loom, only to be itself, and stepped where Jonah had stepped, making their noise the same shape. The cellar exhaled earth potatoes, old wood saved cold. Jonah climbed, first tested each rung, turned, and offered his forearm. The shadow used him as a measure, not a ladder. At the bottom, he set the heat pack on a crate and pointed to the warmest stone wall. He meant one guest. Two came. A smaller shape hovered at the hatch, an ankle cinched by fine snare wire meant for fox. A broader figure followed and kept her shoulders above the threshold, holding the seam between ground and air. Jonah raised his hand, "Friend, wait safe." Then cut the wire the way he'd cut the steel leverage over speed. He wrapped the ankle, tucked a second heat pack under a blanket so warmth would be an invitation, not an order. The broader figure's breathing slowed a degree, not trust on loan. Bootsteps scuffed the yard. Metal clicked against metal, trap language in human hands. Jonah turned the lamp down to a poorer light, slipped the stovepipe so heat bled into the cellar without drawing a line in the night. "If I knock twice slow, go deeper," he whispered. "If I don't knock, we're past plans." He met two men at the door, hats, low, a coil of snare wire over one arm, a sack of teeth on the other. "Evening read." "Any commotion?" "Wind tower," Jonah said. "She sings when the weather swings." He let his eyes drift, bored and steady. "Your bells talk on the north line. Either your traps learned to walk or your knots forgot their job. Regulations say we can look the smiling one tried." "My door says no." Jonah answered, shoulders set in the frame. Across the pasture, a bell shivered short, long, short, where he'd rigged a misdirection to the sawmill. Both men turned their heads without meaning to. "Hear that?" Jonah added, as if curious. "Sounds like your story's over there." They hesitated, then stepped off into their own echo. Jonah held the yard until their boots became smaller than weather. He shut the door, slid the hatch, and went below. The cellar looked like a promise someone had written and forgotten to sign. The little one's eyes had finally chosen sleep. The broader figure reached down and let her hand rest briefly on the injured forearm, a touch that made a bridge without claiming a debt. "Let's call it quiet," Jonah said, checking the bandage, resetting the stones. He sat on the lowest rung so his body could be a door without closing one. Above the storm decided whether to stay. Across the emptier fence, a bell talked to wind and nobody else. Between those two sounds, a new rule found its legs: if you can carry, carry. If you can save, save, and tell no one who wouldn't have done the same. Part 3. Root Cellar Wolves, Trappers and the Storm. The storm arrived like a decision. Snow came slant, then sideways, chewing the light to pieces. In the root cellar, the air held steady, potato cool, human warm. The injured wrist pulsed against the heat pack without panicking. The little one slept with the blanket tented, so the warmth was chosen, not forced. Above, the cattle shifted once, twice. Then another sound crossed the roofline, pause, not boots, wolves, drawing a straight line to the smell that men had started. Jonah cracked the hatch an inch, listened, and closed it again. "We wait," he said, and set his palm flat on the joist as if patience were something you could brace with wood. Boots returned before the wolves finished their circle. Two voices tighter now, the kind men use when they want the world to match their plan. One raked a pole along the siding, testing for hollows. The other worked a latch they didn't own. Jonah slid the stovepipe free so heat bled under the floor in a hush, and with his left hand tugged the misdirection cord he'd tied to the tin bells at the sawmill. Short, long, short. The reply came back from the mill's torn doorway as if the storm itself had a mouth. The wolves peeled toward the noise the way weather peels toward pressure. Evening again, Jonah said when the knock finally came. No welcome in it, just weather inside the word. He didn't step back from the frame. Storm's getting the better of the line. "You lose something. Tracks end at your yard," the wireman said. Snow glittered on his hat brim, mean as powdered glass. The sack of teeth hung heavier. "Tracks end a lot of places in a blow," Jonah answered. "Sometimes on purpose." He let the pause hang until the wind filled it. "You want the mill. Something keeps ringing you there." They pushed once. The door didn't give. "Regulations," the smiler tried again, but even he sounded tired of the costume. "Regulations don't talk men into my cellar," Jonah said. He didn't raise his voice. He raised his chin a quarter-inch the distance a door travels from almost shut to shut. Across the dark the wolves spoke a low chord that didn't ask permission. The men measured that sound against the cold in their gloves and decided to be brave someplace else. "Circle back at first light," the wireman said to nobody in particular. They went the way they had come, smaller than the weather that carried them. Jonah barred the door and let his forehead rest on old pine. The barn became a room again. He slid the hatch and dropped into the cellar with snow pinned to his shoulders like badges he hadn't asked for. "We hold till dawn," he said. He checked the wrist, less heat, better color, retied the edge of the bandage without waking the arm it served. He loosened the little one's wrap a finger width so the blood could remember its route. The broader figure watched and didn't correct him. That was its own language. The storm did its work. Wind scoured the yard clean of plans. The bell at the mill kept talking to no one until the line iced and went dumb. In the long middle hour when a man's mind tries to make up monsters to pass the time, Jonah counted what he could count. Breaths. Not's the way fear settles when it has a job. When the wolves gave up and the wind stepped down a key, he let himself think about dawn. He knocked twice on the joist, slow, not a warning, a promise that the waiting was almost over. The cellar held its quiet. Above them, the world began to sound separate again, distinct drips, distinct rafters, a hinge that had its own opinion. Soon, he said, and for the first time all night he sounded certain. At gray light he opened the hatch. The yard wore a new skin. Snow had blurred the night's map, erased everything but intention. The wolves were gone. The line of boots had become weather. He wrapped the little one's ankle fresh and tucked a wool scrap inside the binding so every step would say, "Not yet," and "not never." He shouldered the lantern, lifted the lighter child, and nodded for the injured one to take his coat. The broader figure rose last and put her palm on the ladder as if thanking the tree it had been. They moved as a small, deliberate weather toward the fence. At the fence line, the world paused. Trees held their breath. The mother came out of the firs like a sentence finishing itself. The elder placed one hand on the snow and one on the rail and waited. Jonah knelt. He didn't offer. He let the choice move from his hands to theirs. The little one leaned. The elder took the weight as if handed a tool he respected. The injured one looked at Jonah one quick, lucid glance, then crossed two. The mother gathered them without claiming what wasn't hers. Jonah lifted his empty hands. "I'll keep quiet," he said, and then spoke with his palms, "Friend safe enough." The elder faced him fully, and with grave care touched 2 fingers to the cutter's ghost on Jonah's boot. Then he pressed those same fingers to the fence post where a sign might hang. Not a treaty, a root. They stepped back into the timber, not as escape, but as home. Snow swallowed their last print and somehow left the path easier to see. The mark on the barn nail. By noon, the storm had forgotten the yard. The bells on the south fence lay glazed and still. Jonah swept the aisle, fed the cattle, set the oil stove to a smaller, humbler flame. On the work shelf, he cleaned the cutters and hung them where they had always belonged, then painted a thin white slash on one handle. Not a beacon. A private mark that meant there is a way out of the wrong kind of steel here. He found it on the step where boots knock snow clean, a small old thing placed square his father's folding knife initials, R. Reed scratched deep. Lost the day the sawmill closed, returned by a route no story would have believed before last night. He thumbed the hinge. It opened without complaint. At dusk he walked to the fence and hung nothing, no flag, no bait, no dare. He looked at the timber and let the timber look back. Debt's a bad word for this, he said. Let's call it quiet. The wind tower turned once untroubled. Somewhere in the firs, a branch gave up its snow in a soft rush. That was answer enough. If this night felt like a light in your own window, tell us where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments, and when the story ends, rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe for the next Winter on the Ridge. Some things break into your life not to take, but to ask for the one tool you didn't know you were keeping.